Welcome to our Hospice Peterborough podcast, Conversations about Dying. And I'm Julie Brown, and I'm here with my friends and colleagues,
Red Keating
and David Kennedy. And today we're really delighted to have with us a special guest. And I would like to welcome Brian Nichols to this podcast. And today I think we're in for a real treat to explore some of the issues of his experience around being with people in their dying and also in the grief piece as well in another culture. So Brian, why don't we begin today, and thank you for being with us, but why don't we begin with you just briefly telling us a bit about you and your history a little bit.
Sure. Nice to be here. I think it was around 2002 I decided after retiring from work I would start going to Zimbabwe. And I went 10 times over a 10-year period. So each year I would go for a month living in a hospital in a rural area of Zimbabwe as opposed to in the urban area. And while I was there early 2000, a lot of AIDS was happening. So about 90% of the people who came to the hospital, whether they came for some other reason, but they were HIV infected. Indeed, even 40% of the staff who worked in the hospital were HIV infected. So what I experienced over that 10-year period is very specific to Zimbabwe, rural Zimbabwe, and in a hospital context where many people are dying, even in a few days, HIV related.
Wow. Tell us a bit about your background and why on earth you would even be interested in that.
From a hospice perspective, I think I've been a volunteer here for about 35 years. But I was trained as a psychotherapist, so I have a doctorate in applied psychology and background. Often bringing art to dying and to the process of being within another culture. So even in Zimbabwe, I would take digital cameras. I would take 10 of them. This is in an area where there is almost no electricity and no access to computers or cameras. Having people document, there's an ambulance coming by. Having people document what their lives were like. So loved going, changed my view of myself and the world. And I am no expert, and I am white, and I'm talking about a culture that I'm not part of, but I can certainly share some observations.
Brian, what drew you to that trip the very first time you went? Was it a calling? Was there an impetus to?
Julie, you know what? I was 50, and I decided after 25 years to leave teaching, and there was a sense for me that I was still young and still had energy, and that I had something to offer and to learn about, and I needed to go and do that. So there was calling, maybe too strong a word, but a curiosity and a desire to do something in the world that really mattered. So 25 years of teaching was enough to say I could stay there and retire. And that's now 18 years ago. So it's been a real trip the last 18 years. And it has taken me to other countries as well, Haiti, parts of Russia, and working in those places. I think other cultures have lots to teach us about our own, who we are.
Is there a sense that things culturally, when you're in those other experiences, what is your first? I guess what I'm asking is, what is the biggest experience of difference that you confront?
I think here in Peterborough, here in Canada, I don't ever feel very different. I feel pretty invisible. Certainly and especially in rural Zimbabwe, where for many children they have never seen a white person. So Zimbabwe was Rhodesia, so it was colonized by the Brits, and at one point there would have been a number of 10% maybe of the population were white and wealthy and farmers. So to go there now, especially in a rural area, being white and being an old guy, again, AIDS has decimated the country. So there would be very few people my age, people 50 or over. Those coming into the hospital were generally, they look about 10 years younger than they are. So even a 16-year-old looks about 6 or 7. because they have probably been born with HIV. So, David, I guess the answer would be here I might sometimes believe I know everything, and when I'm there, I know nothing.
Mm.
Luckily for me, English was spoken by people who attended school. So I could almost always find someone who would understand what I was asking. What I found, I loved being there. They would greet me as I arrived and let me know I was home.
Mm-hmm.
I'd come home again. And it felt that way.
There was a sense of homecoming.
There really was.
Like, I'm supposed to be here.
People I cared about, people who cared about me, yes. And I believe I brought something. I wasn't coming with medical knowledge, but was coming with some death and dying knowledge, and even just about how to play. So, and a comfort with HIV and how to be present to that. There was a lot of stigma in those days about being infected, which sounds very strange when people were so infected and so many were infected. But I came with a comfort around the illness, which many people there didn't have.
Did the reception you received change over the course of the decade? Like what was your feeling of your first stepping down? You're there. What was that reception like?
Well, Red. I mean, even getting off the plane, saying, "What have I done? Why do I think I have anything to offer people here?
Right.
Who do I think I am?"
Mm-hmm.
And I've signed up for a month. I mean, there was no leaving early. And there would be times I would arrive for that whole month. We would not have any electricity or water. We would be hauling water from the well with everyone else to flush a toilet. We would be cooking, we would probably be begging locals to cook some food for us. I would go and buy eggs and ask them to boil them for me because there was no way of cooking food. So it was, what do I know? What do I have to offer? First impressions. How beautiful the country is. How gorgeous the gardens are. How friendly people are. How curious they are about who I am. Ultimately, how much they welcomed me. And not just me, how much they welcomed others. In a country where there's a lot of black-white prejudice. Sometimes I would forget because the Canadian doctor is a white guy, Paul Thistle, and his wife is a black Zimbabwean Shona woman, and their kids are black and white. I would often be with Padrina in the city and would forget that now we're being presented as a mixed racial couple, and there's lots of stigma around that. So I guess I got to live a lot of those things quite vicariously. And there would have been certainly some black folks who didn't want us in the country and made it quite clear. It would be perceived by some to be dangerous to be there. So all that. Things I'm totally oblivious to, like poisonous snakes. I grew up, in the Kawarthas where snakes are kind of like, you pick them up and pet them.
Well, I don't.
Well, I was going to say, some people might. That would not be the case for me.
I like snakes enough. And they can be quite small and extremely poisonous. Saw it all the time, people being bitten by snakes and then having limbs amputated. Yeah.
So you as you mentioned, Brian, came with a background of the arts, and that's part of what you do in your work with people in their dying and in grief. Mm-hmm. What was it like to do that cross-culturally?
It worked. Almost, certainly with the children, you'd be starting from scratch. They would never have seen paint or markers or crayons even, or paper. When I was in the country, there was no paper. Even to get a passport, you couldn't get one because I remember coming through with a journalist from Peterborough, and we needed to get some forms to allow him to be in the country. We had to wait more than hours for someone to find a piece of paper. So it was that we had to bring what we needed to share. So I would bring children's books, picture books, because I love them and they're light. But people couldn't keep them until I left. I had to keep passing them around to the adults as well. Now, this is also a country, I don't want to misrepresent them. This is a country that had an education system equivalent to Canadian system in terms of universities. Now, all that they went to shit during the times that I was there. This is the Mugabe era. And things were really rough. So many had not been in school, would never go to school. I think about 8% of the population had work. But the work often meant you didn't go home at night because you couldn't afford your work didn't pay enough to pay the bus fare. You slept on your desk or under the desk. Even professors, doctors, nurses. We're talking very rough times. People were starving to death. That sort of went away from me. So the things I would bring, I would bring balloons. Maybe no longer politically correct. We shouldn't have them in the environment. But to have a single balloon that we would use on the ward, even with a group of men, that became a focus and a toy and a way of communicating. And I would bring oil, massage oil. And I would show people, you don't go to the hospital alone. You always go to the hospital with someone to look after you. There aren't enough doctors, nurses, healthcare people. You would starve. They don't feed you. So there was not just the people, and there would be a couple of hundred people. A couple of hundred people every day coming to outpatient in wheelbarrows and being pushed in ox carts, coming with crutches they'd made. I mean, there's no ambulance and there would be maybe about 300 in the hospital. And then the equal number looking after them, lying on the floor, trying to find food. So it's a very different experience than going to see a patient in his or her room. Mm-hmm. Anything I did was wide open in the ward, oftentimes outside even. One year we arrived, the maternity ward, the ceiling had just collapsed with everyone in it. It would never have been fixed, but we used to bring money from Peterborough that we raised, sometimes 30, 40, 50,000. And we would arrive and say, how do you want to use the money? We actually literally painted the ward ourselves. We hired people to buy the drywall and fix it. Those things otherwise couldn't have happened. So bringing the art stuff is a real luxury and a real way of connecting. I would take a lot of beads with me. Not a lot of markers because I don't like plastic, but crayons, pencil crayons. And I'd just go from bed to bed. I'd have to take pieces of cardboard with me. Otherwise, there's no way that they can draw. So I learned a lot each trip I made. Every year I'd go back, I would have a better sense of how to be there. But literally, I would be getting out of the vehicle that came to the airport to get me. And I would be told right as I got out of the vehicle where I was to go on the ward. Who was right now in need of what it was I would have brought. And it wasn't as much me. The things I brought were just a way of being present. I mean, really badly burnt children, because they do all their cooking in the middle of their homes on the floor. So young children, if they can walk or crawl, often get into the fire. Bites from crocodiles and snakes, so amputation often. Infections that just wouldn't be cleared up. Hydrocephaly, huge number of hydrocephaly, water on the brain, kind of kids who were extreme retardation, and shunts were too late. So people came to the hospital typically to die. And I just became part of that team who would journey with them through that last part of their lives.
Do you have any stories? Like, what's it like? What do you carry with you from that?
You know what? It's been a few years since I've been. Partly my own health no longer allows it, and the country became more difficult to enter into. David, it's interesting, and Julian read, it's interesting that I have more memories now, sort of 5 years out, having not been back. I think while I was going regularly, I kind of pushed stuff down. And now I dream much more about it. And it's more, the content I'm dealing with is more challenging. Where before I think I just got on with it. I mean, just one quick story. The crocodiles are, I want to say everywhere, but they're not everywhere. They're just in the rivers. But there's a river very close to the hospital. Will save you maybe 3 hours if you come through the river rather than around the river. And so there are young men who have sticks, and they will take you across the river. So if a crocodile comes, they will hit the crocodile with the stick. But this young mother was coming across one day, and crocodiles came and got her. She had left a baby on the bank, or managed to get a baby back on the bank, but she had a baby on her back, wrapped up in fabric on her as she carried it. But she ended up losing, now I forget whether she lost both legs or just one leg and one arm to the crocodile. So she's in the hospital. One child has survived, one has died. She herself now is not going to work in the fields or be able to care for her family. So the pain that she was experiencing around her grief, we were using with her fingernail polish to polish her nails, bringing water in to wash her hair and to comb it, really giving her the kind of care that a mother, and she was someone who didn't have someone caring for her, but the kind of care that a mother would give to a daughter who had been through a significant trauma. We helped actually pay for an artificial leg for her, kept in touch with her over a number of years. So long relationships were developed. We would see some people would come back to the hospital knowing that I or others were there. They knew the time of year that we traveled. Everyone's related in the area anyway, and they would say, I heard you were back. I've come to say hello. Mm-hmm. And so there were real relationships. Now, that person I can think of, he was hit by a telephone pole that fell down in a storm. So I think broke both his legs. He was in the hospital, a young man with children. He was in the hospital for a few months, recuperating. Children who we put people into traction. No, we typically put casts on, and you go home the same day. Yeah, not there. There's no material. There's nothing. The stuff isn't there. You're put into traction, a young child, for 30 days with a broken arm or leg, and adults even longer. Sometimes I would get frustrated because they didn't have any rope, so they couldn't hook up the traction. So the kid has been there already 10 days, and they haven't yet put him into traction. And I'm saying, okay, let's start ripping up some sheets, and we will we'll braid them in there. Or who's going into Harare? Here's some money. We can buy some rope. We'll find some rope there. So it's a rural hospital. It's very little service, barely survived. Amazing people, incredible people. But the kinds of things that we would expect to happen aren't going to happen. Yeah.
So I'm just curious in terms of how they approached, or how did they manage so many deaths, and what was the reaction from the people? Like, I mean, when you're surrounded by that much death and loss, I mean, you're talking about a lot of amputations, children. That is just so much loss. How did the people cope?
And I think we're talking really here generations of loss. But you're right, Red, and the hospital itself, and then they were related to you. It wasn't as if you didn't know who that person was whose baby just died. It would be your brother's wife's second cousin. Well, here, let me slightly change my answer. I was curious by the huge stigma around AIDS. I would have assumed because so many staff were infected and so many people who came to the hospital were HIV infected, and we're talking end-of-life infected, there was still huge denial. So you didn't have AIDS, you had tuberculosis. Now, we knew if you had tuberculosis, you also had AIDS. But people didn't actually even I remember a parent receiving a death certificate of their 19-year-old son, and it said HIV, and they're devastated. Somehow it seemed they didn't know it. So how do people deal with that kind of chronic, if that's the right word, death? You know what? It becomes, I think, part of your existence, almost expected. You don't expect all of your children to live. You don't expect someone who's off to the city to come back alive. You don't expect to raise your own children. Somebody else will raise them. Were people depressed? I mean, certainly sometimes, and certainly some of the treatment. There's no psychiatric treatment. A couple of them that stand out for me. One would be a young man with schizophrenia, and I'm saying to the hospital, and without diagnosing, I have a doctorate in psychology, but I can't diagnose. But clearly, this is schizophrenia, or clearly this is autism, extreme autism. They'd never heard the term. There are no drugs in the country at that point for schizophrenia. So they tie them up, chain them up actually, outside. And usually they die because animals come and get them. So when you put the context into how people live every day, dying is not such a big deal. It's not unheard of. There's no, certainly in the rural area, there's no funeral home, there's no funeral director, oftentimes there's no churches as such, there's no people who take over the care. If your mother is dying, you and you're 12 years old or 8 years old or 6 years old, you look after her till she dies. And you're likely to bury her in the anthill. Body is wrapped in some fabric or a rattan rug and put inside the anthill, and the ants or termites will clean the body. Mm. And when you go talk to your mother or introduce your mother to your friends, dead mother, you go to the anthill. The first few times I was shocked by it. But I think when everything is life and death in pretty equal terms. Now, still, when someone died in the hospital, there would be weeping and wailing and carrying on in a way that we wouldn't see probably in most Canadian hospitals. So people grieve very, very openly.
And then what after that?
Mm-hmm. So there are so many dependings here. Talking Zimbabwe or Rhodesia, about 85% would identify as being Christian. But they probably also, most or all of them, would also identify with another cultural religion as well. Now, there are 25 different totems within the country, in the same way that our First Nations people would have a totem, a clan that they belong to. So death rituals are based on your totem. So if you are snake or bird or bear, I guess they don't have bears, antelope or lion, then there are certain ways in which the body is cared for. The people in that totem can't perform the rituals. It has to be someone from another totem. So hard to talk here, but hard to talk there about how things are done. When I was there, the president, Mugabe, was asking people not to use coffins. A coffin would cost between $20 and $25, and people just didn't have the money. Mostly what I saw in the room, there's also something, when you have your funeral or the ritual around your death, the more people who come and grieve, the more likely it is that you will go successfully to heaven and also be happy in the afterlife. I believe across the country there is a belief, a strong, strong belief in the afterlife. You must return to where you were born when you die, if you possibly can. If you don't, you'll be unhappy. And if you're unhappy as a spirit, then you're going to make life miserable for those around you. So even at any important meal, you feed everyone, even those who have died. Plates are put out for them. If you have a bottle of something, you pour it onto the ground to give them. If you don't care for them, and I would have seen the same thing in Indonesia, in Bali, in Thailand. Each day, offerings were put out on every opening in your house to feed the spirit world. So a very strong sense of spirit world. Prior to my being there, and probably prior to independence, people had above ground, I don't know what they were called, big boxes where bodies were put. And they were often painted and decorated with flowers and looked after, and were right beside your house, sort of in front of your house. Nobody had money when I was around for cement. So historically, bodies were taken back to the homestead, put in above ground. And I was thinking, why above ground? Well, you know what? They didn't have shovels. The things that we would take for granted, you dig a grave, no. Also, it's very fertile land. You wouldn't want to take up a lot of valuable farmland for bodies. But I would do a lot of hiking in the mountains or the hills, and everywhere there was a crevice, there would be painted on it a person's life and death, and the body would have been shoved into the crevice, stones put in front of it, and it would be cemented up. So bodies were often taken into the hills. And the more traditional religions took place in the hills, not down in the farmland. So again, I've already forgotten what the question was, but the things people did varied considerably, depending upon whether you're Ndebele or Shona, and then what your totem is. And how, I think rural and urban, I think, just a second, my observation would be many people around the hospital pretended to be Salvation Army or Seventh-day Adventist or Anglican, if that's what got them work. And then quietly, privately on the side, they still honored their more traditional religion.
What did you observe in terms of the common humanity of all of us in when it comes to death and dying and grief?
David, I mean, the common humanity was there so logically for me. And I think when we pare our lives down to what is basic, we're just all so much the same. There, it's very common. I would be referred to as Grandfather Brian. I'd like it better if I was just Father Brian. But, and for a while, I thought it was a bit hokey, and that maybe people were attempting to get, Brother Brian, getting close to me, so that I would give them something. And certainly, even though giving them something, sometimes it felt uncomfortable. People would be asking me directly. I'd be often there in November, December, and it would be, "Where's my box?" And that's an old saying here around Boxing Day. So when the wealthy when they get their new presents, they put the things they got into a box for the poor and left it outside the door. So the tradition there continues. So I got used to, I never brought anything back with me. Well, I would wear clothes on the plane, but everything else, my running shoes, my flip-flops, anything I could would stay there. Sometimes I would identify ahead of time who I was going to give it to. Even as I would arrive, I would say, "Yes, this year you can have my running shoes when I leave." That would be the only pair maybe in their lifetime that they would get. That would be relatively new. But all my clothing would be staying there. Sometimes I would give it to the hospital. Other times I would give it to a particular family. But there was a sense that you belonged to specific families, that I was their son, that I was their brother. And it wasn't just, I'm convinced it was not around manipulation. It really was a cultural way of living, of how you support each other. I did not feel, you know what? It's only a month every year. It was only 10 years. I often felt more comfortable in Zimbabwe than I felt back home in Peterborough. Now, part of it was I would leave there and arrive here sometimes Christmas Eve or Christmas the day before Christmas, Boxing. And that's a horrible time to come back into this culture. But I would go into the local, IGA in East City to buy something, and I would just burst into tears. There was just so much excess. And that's not a big box store. That's a little tiny grocery store. Zimbabwe, rural Zimbabwe, Choweshe, felt more real. And I could be more real. I didn't have to have the right color shoes. Nothing mattered. But who I was, except who I was.
And so when you say, the common humanity, like we're more the same.
Yes.
What is that the same for you? What is that sameness that unites us in that common humanity, in your opinion?
Yeah, sort of like we are born, we live whatever life we're offered, and we die. We don't take anything with us. It doesn't matter what you do, but who you are during that time, and the importance of family and community. The people there. I remember being there. I'm not sure what the occasion was, but they baked a cake. Now that required an old coffee tin, a hole in the ground, coals and fire put into the ground, and keeping it going, like, I don't know how long, to bake a cake. And it was because I was there. They, we might go and buy a great big something at Dairy Queen, an ice cream cake. Which has much less meaning than the small things that you do there. I would notice that some people like myself, Murungus were called, white people from away, boss, would not choose to eat with local people or would ask for a fork. And to me, I found it really embarrassing that they would say, I don't eat sudza, corn ground up, boiled. And to me, you don't say that. And I don't ask for a fork. I figure out how to eat with my fingers. And I'll eat whatever they're gonna. I've eaten things that I would not eat here: snake, the entrails of goat. But nothing is going to hurt me, and it doesn't matter how it tastes. They're sharing food. So there's a humanity. Well, guys, you guys all know it already. There's something here even about being with people who know they're dying. There's something just so wonderful about that because there's no bullshit. We're not going to talk about stupid stuff. We're going to talk about what really matters.
I often talk about it in terms of the armor that's stripped away, right? The armor that we accumulate over. We're not born with it, but we accumulate it as we live in this world and relate to each other and our hurts and our wounds and our fears. And then there's something that starts to happen when we're living as we're dying with life-threatening illness, that armor starts to dissolve.
Yes. I
think, and the purity of, if you will, starts to shine through of who we are often.
And maybe it's the vulnerability.
That's what I think.
People there was another young man I'm going to tell you about it, and his brother was studying social work and was in 3rd or 4th year in Harare. And he came to the hospital not once, a few times, to try to talk to me about his younger brother, who was maybe 15, 16. And from his studies, he figured out his brother had schizophrenia. And both of their parents had died. Father had been a teacher. They both had died of AIDS. They're being raised by their grandparents. He asked if I would come and meet his brother. And his description of him was certainly of psychosis. And I said, sure, come to the hospital and walk me to where you live. It was a hot sun. I burnt up, even with a hat. And anyway, we walked to the house. And I took my laptop with me. I'm not even sure why, but I thought a 15-year-old, an old guy. I mean, what can I bring that might be of interest? Anyway, the younger brother, I created a relationship. The brother was no longer attending school. He was probably smoking dope, ganji. The headmaster had kicked him out because he took a shortcut across the field and got to school late one morning. Headmaster clearly didn't like him. I negotiated with him to get him back into school. Originally not there. We took him to a different school. But we'd been supporting this other high school. And eventually I said to the headmaster, we will withdraw all support unless you welcome this kid back. Anyway, he began borrowing cameras. I used to take cameras with me so they could photograph their own lives. And he would come to the hospital almost every day and sit with my laptop and download the photos he had taken. We developed such a positive rapport with each other around his photos and around language, and I made him write for me. So even before he could use it the first time, he had to write a paragraph on 5 different things about his life. So I gave him the hard line. And I would give him a hard time that he was late, but then I realized they don't have any watches. He was doing well to get there. Anyway, I'm still in touch with this young man. And even when I stopped going near his community, he would find out that I was near Harare or I was coming through, and he would make an effort to come and say hello. He didn't have schizophrenia. He was certainly psychotic, and he was certainly struggling with suicidal ideation. But life is so pared down, and there's so little to hope for. So even the brother with a social work degree, he's not likely to ever find work, paid work. In his case, he actually did. He came back to that hospital, actually. But oftentimes the work doesn't give you more than a bit of food. But the pared downness of life and what's really important gets talked about. And you follow the season, and you go to bed when it's dark, and you get up when it's light, and you do what you have to do during that day to get something to eat, or to visit somebody, or to care for someone.
But you mentioned suicidal ideation. Is there much suicide?
Yes. Yeah, I would think way more than gets talked about. Yes.
How is that viewed culturally?
I mean, this family, I'll talk about them only, they were very concerned this young man would kill himself. I didn't hear it from a religious perspective that it was wrong or bad, but that they loved him and that he had a life in front of him and that people kept hoping for better lives. You know what, in some ways he would also be needed. They were farmers. He'd be needed on that grandparents' farm to help feed them, to look after them in their old age. They were a delightful, lovely, lovely couple. Suicide. Mental illness, David, seemed to have more stigma. I remember a young man, a father, who had attempted, I don't know whether he was successful, he attempted to kill his wife and children. And he was brought in on the back of a military police truck, but he had jumped off. So he was all road burnt. And they were bringing him to the hospital. I'm not even quite sure exactly why he was going to be hospitalized. Maybe after the jumping off of the truck. But the people in the hospital kind of refused to care for him because of what he had done. I believe maybe now he had actually killed his wife and children. I don't hold that same kind of judgment. So I began to care for him. And so he had no one looking after him the way that another family would bring someone with them. And often it was men who came to care for other members of their family, which is interesting. Here, I think we would think women. So your younger brother comes and looks after you, or your father. Anyway, so they wouldn't put sheets on his bed. They wouldn't give him any clothes to wear. They wouldn't give him food. They wouldn't talk to him. You know, I know where sheets are kept. I went and found sheets. I found him a pillow. I took some of my clothes and gave them to him. I actually took a pail and cleaned his body. It was all covered in blood and bits of gravel. And so there's that kind of stigma or judgment against some kinds of behavior. But this is a pretty horrific country where they've killed a lot of, most of the Entebele, one of the tribal groups, has been killed off. 50,000 of them by the government. I would meet just people who weren't in favor of the current government, the regime, and they would be blinded. They would be houses burnt down. They would be murdered. It's a vicious, difficult. And these same I would go to, this was a Salvation Army run church I was in. I would go to the church for some of the 4-hour service most Sundays. And I would know that beside me would be some of the same people who were murdering other people in the hospital, responsible for their deaths. It's a strange place to be. That I had some difficulty around it, but I just had to accept that's the way it was.
I think we could have a whole other podcast where we haven't even talked about the trauma pieces of this. Yeah. I can't imagine what's come out of it, but yeah.
So I think there's such trauma there all the time. And life is often not valued.
Yeah.
Even this doctor from Canada, who was the head of the hospital, there were people who attempted his life many times. And he was Salvation Army. He did all the right things. Though he did all the right things, though there was some suspicion he might have supported the other party. Though I know he actually didn't. He chose neutral.
Well, I'm thinking, David, on your comment there in terms of, I think we're maybe coming to the end of our time, but one of the things I've just sort of got in my head is Brian, how have these experiences changed you? You know, and how are you different as a person today? You said your memories are stronger now, 5 years out.
Mm-hmm.
But 5 years out, how do you think? What are the couple of things that have really changed you as a person that you hold and carry with today?
I think a real big appreciation for the small things I have in my life. I mean, one certainly would be health. And I don't need other things. And even as I wander around Peterborough, I'm doing some volunteer work now with One Roof. And when someone comes in the door who has lost everything, you know, his garbage bags full of clothing got stolen, I have extreme empathy. No matter what he looks like, tattoos on his face, scars all over his body, I have less judgment of what's within the norm and who needs love. So even there, I mean, this young man who had murdered his family, he still needed love. He needed to be looked after. And I think I brought that back with me, a real deeper sense of caring. And what can I do right now today? I don't need to build a big building. I don't need to get a whole bunch of funding. What can I do? So this young man on Monday who was getting some new clothing, he needed a big bag. I went to my car and found some grocery bags. I said, hey, do you want these? Can you use them? What can I do right now?
Immediacy.
Immediacy. Yeah. Small things.
It's amazing how myopic we become, and our circumstances often make us feel, you know, whether we're hard done by or we're suffering. I think for any person who travels and exposes themselves to cultural differences and the challenges of life, I'm hopeful, Brian, that common piece of our humanity that we talked about will also cause us to have a much more compassionate approach to not just others, but even to ourselves.
Yes. David, don't you think COVID, in a very small way, has done that?
Yes.
More people out walking, more people saying hello, more people checking on their neighbors, valuing the things that we took for granted before.
Certainly hope so.
I hope we stay a long time. I hope it has a permanent impact.
I hope so.
And just even bringing it here to Hospice Peterborough, this is one of the reasons why I'm such a big believer in offering groups, because of that common humanity piece, that I think that when we are with each other in our grief, in our pain, that hopefully our stories may sound different, but the things we need, the love, the care, the support, is the same.
Yeah. I know you're trying to end this. I this morning met with 10 new people who on Zoom who all have cancer. We just started another new group, and it is amazing how beneficial, how appreciative, and how much fully they connected, even in a 1-hour Zoom with each other. It blows me away, the importance of group, of our humanity.
Yeah.
Thank you, Brian.
Thank
My
you.
pleasure.
Thank you so much for your sharing. And I know we could be here for hours.
I thought we just started.
Yeah. So, but we appreciate it, and you have challenged all of us. And I think what I've heard from you, even in the sense that even if we don't get a chance to go to Zimbabwe or Thailand, we live in a culture, we live with humanity and people, and all around us is the opportunity to be much more compassionate and giving.
Here, here.
Thank you.